My official welcome to everyone to our first CAN meeting of 2022. I'm Ann Coffey, the CEO of CNPE and one of the coordinating hosts of CAN. Thank you for being with us today. I know I say this every meeting, but we so deeply believe it, that your presence is helping us stay connected, deepening our understanding of what is important in our community and learning together. We believe that understanding is key to real sustainable change. So CAN is a forum for nonprofit social impact leaders, volunteers, and funders to hear about the most pressing needs and issues of our community. Of course, everyone is welcome. Over this past year, we have examined public safety through various lenses and from a number of vantage points. We prepared a summary of what we learned that we'll be discussing today. And just in case you haven't seen the summary, Merv's going to put a link in the chat, so you'll have that in just a moment. And of course, it will be on our website in the future. This morning, Ed Cordes will review the summary report, and then we will break out into groups to explore the public safety ecosystem and identify the gaps in our community's efforts to provide a safe and healthy community. And we will discuss where we go from here. And this is the opportunity to figure out how to take action, either individually, as an organization, or as a collective or collaborative. As a reminder, we will be recording the program portion of these sessions. And when we break out into groups and then come back out and report out and discuss, that portion will not be recorded. We ask that everyone stay on mute, but that doesn't mean do not engage. Please put your comments, questions in the chat. As you know, CNPE is committed to ensuring that our programming reflects the diversity of organizations in our community and the people in them. To make sure we understand who is here, we will put up a quick poll so you can tell us. The key data will help us develop a deeper understanding of which voices we are attracting and which voices we are not. So there you go. I promise you that we will not share your personal data. I'm now trying to take this poll while I'm talking to you. Only 4 questions. We did just report that in 2021, 30% of those attending our programs were BIPOC, primarily Black members of our community. So we're headed in the right direction. And it's important that we understand who's here. Thank you, Merv. Let me know when.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce Ed Cordes, who will walk you through the plan. So Ed, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Ann. Good morning, everyone. As Ann mentioned, we looked at all of the recordings. We looked at all of the notes from our 11 meetings last year, centering on public safety, and tried to glean from that some trends, some data, common ideas, and to summarize that for you. Hopefully, you all received an email with a link and maybe had a chance to glance through the report. Right now, I'm just going to go through a brief summary of it, just so that we're all kind of centered and have some information to go into some discussion with. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get on with that. All right, does everyone see that? Okay. Okay, let me get situated here. So this is the summary of the report. So who did we hear from over the past year? In the report itself, it lists all the guests, the speakers, the presenters in the report itself. But generally, we heard from organizations that work directly with public safety and violence, right at the grassroots level, as well as organizations that work with individuals touched by violence, not maybe like a quarter of a step back from those really at the grassroots level. We heard from Metro government agencies, Metro Council, Ocean, and the like. We heard from Metro Police Department, both the police chief as well as the Fraternal Order of Police. We talked to folks from Metro Council. We talked to legislators at the state and federal levels. We talked to folks who have done research. We're part of educational institutions. And we also talked directly to people in the movement for racial equity, social justice, public safety. That includes many of you all, right, who are on the front lines. You gathered in these gatherings, who have participated at that level. So we've heard from a pretty broad range of folks through a good number of lenses. Across all of these groups, we heard from Black folks, African American folks, Latinx folks, other folks of color. We've heard from members of the LGBTQ plus community. We've heard particularly from women and young people. We've heard from people with disabilities, both again as guests and presenters, but also as participants in these CAN meetings. We've gotten sort of the lived experience of you all as you shared your reactions to the topics throughout the year. So if we look at who we heard from, and we can sort of get a sense of the ecosystem around public safety, right? Certainly there are the nonprofit social impact organizations here. These are the folks that we heard from directly, but we can imagine that these entities are part of this ecosystem. Those who, again, who are directly involved in the grassroots, those who work with folks at that level, but also work with people who are experiencing the lack of public safety in our community. So there are a lot of folks in this area that's part of that ecosystem, right? Closely related to that are the folks who are involved in our social movements, the activists, the grassroots organizations, the community organizers. Maybe not as much, no legal formal structure around some of these entities, but certainly structured and with a mission and doing work in the community. We heard from the research best practice policy folks. That's part of the ecosystem, as well as law enforcement and as well as of governance, at all the levels. The mayor's office, Metro Council, state, federal. And then finally, didn't hear directly in terms of guests in many cases, but in terms of folks who participated in these calls, we heard from the funding community as well. So from the last 11 years, we sort of have an idea of what this public safety ecosystem looks like. In your small groups, we're going to ask you to think about that a little bit more later on. So what did we hear over the past year? Well, first of all, we heard about root causes, that the violence, the lack of public safety in our community is really a byproduct of a lot of other issues: racism, houselessness, mental illness, etc. If we want to address violence, if we want to address public safety, we have to address these underlying issues. We heard about funding, or more precisely, the lack of funding and the steady decline of funding for work in public safety, and the need for all sectors to work together collectively to help fund, bring capacity to this work. We heard about the work around advocacy and policy. While Frankfurt and Washington can't really have a direct impact on what's going on in our city, they can be advocates for the work, and they can look at it from a broader level, particularly around funding. So we as individuals and organizations need to engage at that level with folks and press these issues so they are aware and can bring whatever power they have to bear on that. As well as hold them accountable, ask the hard questions. That's particularly true, and really differently true, with Metro Council and the mayor's office. Here we do have a big impact, but we have to step out of our comfort zones, engage folks at these levels, and push for policy, advocate for public safety, ask hard questions, and hold people accountable. What else did we hear? Well, we heard from law enforcement. We heard that law enforcement has a tough job, that it's hard now to recruit police officers. Police officers are leaving. But we also heard strongly that policing should only be part of the total effort to ensure public safety, not the solution to public safety. We heard that we need to stop asking officers to be therapists and social workers, that we have to shift those roles to professionals in those fields who then can work in partnership. Shift the work to them, shift the funding to them. We talked about transparency and inclusion and the lack of it about important processes and decisions related to public safety. And that we really have to rethink what inclusion, what work in hearing different voices in the community, really rethink how we go about doing that. We have to make an effort to go to places we don't go, to listen, to value, and then act upon input from everyone. And it was said many times over the year, this issue has to be embraced by the entire community. It's not a problem of a subset of our community. And it's said many times, well, as well in different ways, white people who aren't directly impacted by the lack of public safety still are part of this community and need to own it. And then we also talked about the movements. And again, these are folks that may not be running nonprofits, may not be part of a government organization, may not be part of a business, any sort of legal entity, but they are doing the work on the ground. They are structured. They have goals. A lot of folks are devoting a lot of time through the movement in our community. And we need to find ways, those of us who are part of nonprofits, part of other entities, need to find ways to not only honor that work, but to work in collaboration with them. So, if this is who we heard from, and this is what we heard, where do we go from here? We're going to talk more about that in our small groups around a couple of questions. But generally, what seemed to emerge from the last 12 months is 3 areas where there seems to be energy to move. First of all, it's just finding ways to directly support these programs, right? Communicate the need for building the capacity in programs that are working directly for public safety. That means opening up our personal checkbooks. It means advocating for more funding for these organizations with our local representatives. It means for those of us in a position to think about these things, how do we direct the flow of funds to organizations working in these areas? And then for those of us who work in nonprofits, how can we re-envision our work as a nonprofit, whatever we're doing, within our missions, to lend capacity to increasing public safety. So there is a need for direct program support on a lot of levels. We also talked a lot about collaborating. And when we collaborate, not collaborate with those we're comfortable collaborating with, not the usual suspects from our point of view, but really finding ways to collaborate and include folks that we don't normally do, or folks that on the surface or at the beginning may feel uncomfortable to collaborate with. But what we need are networks of folks to come together, because this is a huge endeavor, right? So how can we come together, both as entities and combine efforts to work with one another to address the issues, and how do we actually again move into spaces that we're not comfortable and really make an attempt to hear all voices, and to push our comfort zone a little bit to make sure that everyone's included, everyone is heard. And then finally, where do we go from here? Well, advocacy and policy. A certain amount of this work at root is about systemic change. We have to change our institutions. We have to change the policies that run them. We have to change process at the highest levels. And so we have to really advocate for this work. This is where, coming in and engaging legislators, holding them accountable, asking the hard questions, making sure they know that this is part of what we care about. This is what we are working toward. Um, both do that as an issue in general, but also to advocate on behalf of the individuals and organizations working on the ground in this way. A practical way to do that is to engage Metro Council around budget priorities, to press for more transparency around those decisions, and see that public safety is taken into account to build more capacity. Um, and as I said, to fight for more transparency in this work. So that's an overview of the report. We're not going to discuss the report specifically right now. Rather, we'd like you to take any questions into or additional thoughts into your small groups. We're going to have a lot of time for small groups this time around to have thorough conversations. And to talk about that, I'd like to turn this over to Anthony Smith, a CAN co-host, and he will lead us through the next step. Thanks, Anthony.
No, thank you, Ed, and thanks for really giving a good overview of what we learned for the last year. We spent a lot of time last year talking public safety and talking about all the different key stakeholders and the folks in it, and Ed did a great job of giving an overview. I also want to just thank the center for really creating this space and keeping this space. As many of you all know, for me, this is one of our priorities. If we truly want to have the city that we want, we need to make sure that everybody has safe, healthy, and hopeful communities. And we have not done a great job at that as a city and as a country. And for us to get better, we've got to spend this time having the uncomfortable conversations, as Ed said, but then holding ourselves accountable to action, right? We have now had the conversation. We've moved some things last year. Now it's time for us to take a real move forward in this work. We know that we have a mayoral election this year. We have council members running and not running for. So we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that we stay the course. So we wanted to spend some time of the next little while in small groups. One, debriefing what you just heard from Ed and listening to some questions, but then two, thinking about how we move and how we move as a collective and as individuals. We all sit in positions of power in some form or fashion, and how do we use that to move this agenda to make sure all of us are safe, especially focused on those who have been most impacted by community violence and most by the systems of violence. So we just want to make sure we pay attention to that. So as we get ready to go into our small groups, folks are going to get randomly selected. I don't know who's going where. There's a magic button that Merv's going to push to move us to a place. But there's a couple of questions that we want to make sure that folks are thinking about and discussing when you all go into the small groups. And also when you go in, please identify somebody up front who's going to report out for the group. So that when we come back, we can move into the report out and they can just get you all started. That didn't mean we don't want to hear from all the voices, but if we can have somebody that can start your report out would be nice, and then we can move from there. Questions to ponder and think about with each other. What parts of the public safety ecosystem have we not heard from? Who have we not heard from over the last 11 months, and who do we still need to bring into the conversation? How should this work be coordinated among the members of the ecosystem? And then by whom? Who should be the ones to coordinate it? Other questions to think about. Part two is who do we know is doing the work? Again, we don't know who all is doing the work in the city. I've been trying to figure out who's all in violence prevention and intervention and who's doing the work. And part of it is that we got a lot of people who are just voluntarily doing it. So trying to get a sense of who that is, and so that we can really think about the full ecosystems. What actions can we take away from here? And again, individually or collective. So when we go into our breakouts, you guys will see those in the chat box. We'll make sure that we bring them back into your rooms and the spaces that you're in too. But really trying to think through these questions as a group, and then come back ready to have a candid conversation around them. And remember, this is really our time, again, to hear from each other and our peers, what we went back and took from everything that we talked about last year. We want to make sure that we hit it all. We grabbed everything. Ed spent a lot of time re-listening and reading notes and pulling that stuff together. So we just want to make sure we get it right because this is a representation of what we did last year. So with that, Merv, I think we're ready, unless there's any clarifying questions from anybody before we move into the small groups. But if not, we're ready to go. Does anybody have any questions to help with the discussion as we move forward? Libby Mills, it's so good to see you.
Oh,
It's been a long time. I just saw Libby. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ann.
no, I was just gonna, to refer people, if you haven't had a chance to look at the report, we've literally listed organizations and information that specific to advocacy and so forth. So it's helpful to take a look at that when you're thinking about who's missing, right? So I just wanted to point that out. It's a
How
helpful.
much time? Oh, my bad, Ann. Thank you. How much time do we have in the small groups, Ed? How much time we're spending in there? 25 minutes?
25 minutes, it looks like we'll be able to
Okay.
do that. So time
Okay.
you'll finally have some time for some good convo.
We won't pull you out too quick. You got 25 minutes to be in the small groups. Any other questions or clarifying or thoughts to help us have this conversation? That we would need to have the whole groups here before we go into small groups? Hearing none, I think we're ready to roll, Merv. We'll be back here at 9:50, folks.